Welcome to Whispering Ages. Tonight's story begins with a smile that should never have been seen at a funeral. In the misty village of Hollowmere, where every window hides a watcher and every secret wears a cross, a woman stands beside her husband's grave. The bells toll softly, the mourners weep, but she does not. They say grief makes us strangers to ourselves. But what if grief never came at all? 2 days after the funeral, the churchyard is torn open, and the coffin lies empty. The dead man is gone, and the widow who never wept is suddenly the only one left smiling. It is here that Hercule Poirot and Miss Jane Marple cross paths once more, drawn by curiosity, by compassion, and by the quiet conviction that something far darker than sorrow lies beneath the soil of Hollowmere. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to Whispering Ages, where every mystery hides a heartbeat and every shadow tells a story. And tell me in the comments, what would make you smile at a funeral? Now, the fog is thick, the bells are still, and the grave lies open. Let us begin Part 1, The Funeral. Chapter 1, The Village Draped in Mist. The autumn mist hung over Hollowmere like a burial shroud, turning the cobblestones slick and the gravestones into gray sentinels emerging from nothingness. It was a sort of morning that made one wonder if the sun had forgotten this particular corner of England entirely. Miss Jane Marple stood at the LYCH gate of St. Bartholomew's Church, her gloved hands folded neatly over her handbag, watching the funeral procession with the keen attention she might have given to an unusual bird in her garden. She had arrived in Hollowmere 3 days prior to visit her old school friend, Mrs. Dorothy Bantry, who had taken a cottage here after the sale of Gossington Hall. What was meant to be a peaceful autumn visit had instead coincided with the death of one of the village's most prominent residents. Such a sad affair, Mrs. Bantry murmured beside her, adjusting her black hat. Colonel Venn was only 58, you know, perfectly hale and hearty one day, dead in his armchair the next. Heart failure, Dr. Lyle said. Miss Marple said nothing, but her pale blue eyes remained fixed on the widow. Mrs. Lillian Venn stood at the graveside with the stillness of a porcelain figure. She was perhaps 40, elegantly dressed in black silk that seemed almost too fashionable for genuine mourning. Her face, veiled but visible, bore an expression of such serene composure that it bordered on the uncanny. As the Reverend Phelps intoned the final prayers, Mrs. Venn's lips curved into faintest of smiles. "How very interesting," Miss Marple said softly. "What is, dear?" Mrs. Bantry asked. "That smile. It reminds one of that dreadful business with Mrs. Pritchard's missing husband in St. Mary Mead. She smiled exactly that way at his memorial service. We found him in the cellar 6 months later, you know." Mrs. Bantry shuddered. "Really, Jane, you do have the most morbid associations." As the mourners began to disperse, Miss Marple noticed a small, dapper man with an egg-shaped head and an enormous mustache standing slightly apart from the crowd. He was observing the widow with the same intensity that Miss Marple herself had employed, his green eyes thoughtful beneath tufted eyebrows. "Who is that gentleman?" Miss Marple inquired. "Oh, that's the famous Belgian detective, Hercule Poirot. Can you imagine? Reverend Phelps invited him here. There was some fuss about it. I heard the Reverend had concerns about the Colonel's death, though Dr. Lyle assured everyone it was entirely natural." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice. "Between you and me, I think the Reverend simply wanted to meet a real detective. He's been reading detective stories since he retired from missionary work." "How very providential," Miss Marple said, in a tone that suggested she found nothing providential about it all. Chapter 2, A Matter of Propriety. Later that afternoon, in the drawing room of Venn Manor, the widow received guests with the same unsettling composure she had shown at the graveside. Hercule Poirot accepted a cup of tea from the maid and studied the room with the precision of a jeweler examining a diamond for flaws. The drawing room was expensively furnished but curiously impersonal. Silver-framed photographs covered the mantelpiece, yet none appeared recent. A military medal sat in a glass case, slightly askew from its velvet backing. Everything suggested wealth and respectability, yet something felt staged, like a drawing room in a play rather than a home. I understand, madam, Poirot began delicately, that your husband's death came as a great shock. Indeed, Mr. Poirot. Mrs. Venn's voice was low and musical. Arthur was never ill a day in his life. The heart simply gave out, Dr. Lyle said, a cruel trick of nature. You have my deepest sympathies. It must be a terrible grief to bear. Mrs. Venn's teacup paused halfway to her lips. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Was it grief? Relief? Fear? Before her composure returned. One must bear what one is given, Mr. Poirot. Arthur would have expected strength, not weakness. Your husband was a military man, a colonel. He served in India and later in Egypt. He was very proud of his service. She gestured to the medal. That was for gallantry at Khartoum. The motto is most appropriate, Poirot observed, leaning forward to read the inscription. Fideli jusque la mort. Faithful until death. Most touching. Something in his tone made Mrs. Venn set down her teacup with a slight rattle. Yes, Arthur valued loyalty above all things. At that moment, Reverend Phelps entered, followed by a young woman of perhaps 19 or 20. The Reverend was a tall, thin man with the slightly abstracted air of someone whose thoughts were generally more celestial than terrestrial. Ah, Mrs. Venn, I hope we're not intruding. Miss Harrow wished to pay her respects. The young woman, Alice Harrow, Poirot recalled from his brief research, was pale and red-eyed, her mourning dress hanging loosely on her slight frame. She twisted a handkerchief in her hands. Dear Mrs. Venn, she said tremulously, I still cannot believe he's gone. Uncle Arthur was so alive. Thank you, Alice, Mrs. Venn replied, her voice softening slightly. I know he was fond of you. He was more than fond, Reverend Phelps interjected with gentle firmness. The colonel spoke to me of Alice as if she were his own daughter. He made quite generous provision for her future. Mrs. Venn's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the armrest of her chair. Poirot filed this detail away in his prodigious memory and changed the subject. Reverend Phelps, I understand you were with the colonel shortly before his death? The Reverend blinked, as if surprise be addressed. Yes, indeed. 2 days before he passed. He seemed troubled in spirit. He wished to discuss a matter of conscience, he said, but in the end, he only asked me to witness a document. I assumed it was his will. And did you read this document? Certainly not. That would be most improper. The Reverend looked genuinely scandalized. He sealed it in an envelope and asked me to deliver it to Mr. Cawley, the solicitor, should anything happen to him. Of course, I had no idea that within 48 hours. He trailed off, shaking his head sorrowfully. Poirot's mustaches quivered with interest. And did you deliver this envelope? I did, the very day after the colonel's death. Most efficient. You are a credit to your calling, Monsieur le Reverend. After the visitors departed, Poirot remained for a moment, apparently admiring a watercolor of the village church. In reality, he was watching Mrs. Venn's reflection in the window glass. She stood utterly still, staring at nothing, her hands clenched into fists. When she finally moved, it was to pour herself a substantial measure of brandy, which she drank in one swallow. Poirot let himself out silently, his mind racing with possibilities. Chapter 3, The Gathering Storm. That evening, Miss Marple joined Mrs. Bantry and several other ladies for tea at the vicarage. The Reverend's wife, Mrs. Phelps, was a cheerful, round woman who believed that strong tea and seed cake could solve most of life's difficulties. Of course, Lillian Venn has always been something of an enigma, Mrs. Phelps confided, pouring out the tea with a generous hand. She came to Hollowmere only 3 years ago, when she married the colonel. His first wife, Eleanor, died 10 years back. Consumption, poor thing. Quite the local scandal when Arthur brought home a London bride, so much younger than himself. Was she from London? Another lady asked. I'd heard she was from abroad. Now, let's not gossip, Mrs. Phelps said, in the tone of someone who fully intended to gossip. Though I will say that Dr. Lyle has been most attentive to her since the Colonel's death. Quite solicitous, really. Miss Marple, who had been quietly knitting what appeared to be a scarf of indeterminate length, looked up with mild interest. Dr. Lyle is a physician who attended the Colonel? Yes, dear. Dr. Edmund Lyle. Very distinguished. Graduated from Edinburgh. Came to Hollowmere about 5 years ago. Quite the most eligible bachelor in the village. Until recently. Mrs. Phelps lowered her voice. There have been whispers, you understand. Whispers are such treacherous things, Miss Marple observed placidly. They so often travel faster than truth. Though I didn't notice that Dr. Lyle attended the funeral. Was he a friend of the Colonel's? I wouldn't say friend exactly. The Colonel had very few friends, really. 2 proud in particular. But naturally, Dr. Lyle attended. Professional courtesy, I'm sure. A maid entered and whispered something to Mrs. Phelps, who immediately set down her teacup with a clatter. Good heavens! Ladies, you'll never believe this. Thomas Venn, the groundskeeper, has just come to the vicarage in quite a state. He says... She paused dramatically. He says the Colonel's grave has been disturbed. The coffin is empty. The room erupted in exclamations. Miss Marple's knitting needles, however, never paused in their steady rhythm. How very curious, she murmured. How very curious indeed. Part 2, The Empty Grave. Chapter 4, The Scene of the Crime. By the time Hercule Poirot arrived at St. Bartholomew's churchyard, a small crowd had gathered despite the latening hour and thickening fog. Constable Briggs, a portly man in his 50s who handled most of Hollowmere's law enforcement, which typically consisted of lost dogs and the occasional poached rabbit, stood guard over the open grave with an expression of complete bewilderment. Most irregular, Mr. Poirot, he said, relief evident in his voice at the sight of the detective. In 30 years of service, I've never seen the like. Body snatchers, do you think? Though what they'd want with the Colonel, I couldn't say. Medical schools don't need bodies these days, do they? Poirot knelt at the edge of the grave with surprising agility for a man of his years, examining the disturbed earth with intense concentration. He withdrew a small magnifying glass from his pocket and studied the ground minutely. Tell me, Constable, who discovered this desecration? Thomas Venn, the groundskeeper. He's over there, sir. Briggs gestured toward a stocky man in muddy work clothes who stood apart from the crowd, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. Poirot approached him with his characteristic precise walk. Monsieur Venn, I am Hercule Poirot. You have had a most distressing experience, I think. Thomas Venn ground out his cigarette under his boot. He was perhaps 50, with a weathered face and callous hands. Aye, that I have. Came to check on the grave this evening, routine-like, and found it like this. The earth all dug up, the coffin lid pried open, and nothing inside but the satin lining. Not even his uniform, which Mrs. Venn insisted he be buried in. You say you came to check on the grave. Is this your usual habit? Well, no, sir, not usually. But... Venn shifted uncomfortably. Last night, I thought I saw a light moving about the churchyard. Just a glimpse, mind you, through my cottage window. Could have been a lantern or a candle. I meant to investigate, but by the time I got my boots on, it was gone. Thought I'd imagined it. Truth be told, had a bit to drink that evening. What time was this? Near midnight, I'd say. And tonight, when you discovered the grave, was there any sign of whoever did this? Nothing, sir. Clean as a whistle. They were. Whoever did this knew what they were about. That's a 6-foot grave with hard clay at the bottom. Would have taken hours to dig out quietly. Poirot thanked him and turned his attention back to the grave. The earth had indeed been removed with care, piled neatly to one side rather than scattered. The coffin lid bore marks of a crowbar or similar implement, but the damage was minimal, almost surgical in its precision. A theatrical gesture, Poirot murmured. Too deliberate for mere theft. This was done to send a message, but to whom? And what message? "I say, Poirot," a familiar voice called out. "Constable Briggs mentioned you were here. Dreadful business. What?" Poirot turned to see Dr. Edmund, while approaching through the fog. He was a handsome man of perhaps 40, with dark hair going gray at the temples and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to respect and deference. He carried a black medical bag and wore an expression of concerned professionalism. "Dr. Lyle, bonsoir. You have heard the news quickly. News travels fast in a village like Hollowmere. I came immediately. Thought I might be of some assistance. Though I confess I'm utterly baffled. Who would do such a thing? And why? That, mon ami, is the question that intrigues me most. Tell me, when you pronounced Colonel Venn dead, you were quite certain of the cause?" "Absolutely certain. Cardiac arrest. Almost certainly a massive coronary thrombosis. The colonel had been complaining of chest pains for some weeks, though he refused to take it seriously. Military pride, you know? Thought it showed weakness to admit to illness. Did you conduct a post-mortem examination?" "No need for one. The cause of death was clear, and Mrs. Venn was quite opposed to the idea. She wished her husband to rest in peace with dignity, she said. I saw no reason to distress her further with unnecessary procedures." "I see. And you attended the colonel regularly in life?" A slight hesitation, barely perceptible. "I'd seen him professionally on several occasions. More recently, perhaps, than in previous years. The colonel was not one to admit to weakness easily. And Mrs. Venn? You attend her as well?" "Of course, as I attend most of the families in Hollowmere." Dr. Lyle's tone had cooled slightly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I should see if Mrs. Venn has heard this terrible news. The shock may be quite severe for her." He departed with brisk efficiency, leaving Poirot standing in the fog, his green eyes thoughtful. "Most interesting," he murmured. "Most interesting indeed." Chapter 5. Tea and Deduction. The following morning, Miss Marple found herself taking tea with the vicar's wife when Hercule Poirot was announced. Mrs. Phelps fluttered with excitement at having both a famous detective and a lesser-known, but equally sharp, amateur investigator in her drawing-room simultaneously. "Mr. Poirot, how delightful. You know Miss Marple, of course? She's visiting from St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, this is the famous Hercule Poirot." "How do you do?" Miss Marple said pleasantly, setting aside her knitting. "I've heard a great deal about your methods, Mr. Poirot. So interesting how you employ your little gray cells, as I believe you call them." Poirot's eyes twinkled with amusement and respect. "And I have heard of you also, mademoiselle. You have, I understand, a most remarkable talent for observation. They say you see everything that passes in your village." "One does notice things," Miss Marple admitted modestly. "People are very much the same everywhere, I find. The patterns repeat themselves." "Precisement. It is the pattern that tells the truth. Facts, they can be twisted and arranged. But the pattern, the pattern reveals the human heart beneath." Mrs. Phelps poured out the tea with hands that trembled slightly with excitement. "Have you discovered anything about the terrible business at the churchyard, Mr. Poirot? The whole village is talking of nothing else." "I have discovered several things that interest me greatly. But I wonder, Mademoiselle Marple, what your observations have been. You attended the funeral, I think?" "I did indeed. I found Mrs. Venn's demeanor quite striking. Such composure in the face of grief is always significant. You think she did not grieve?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that grief shows itself most strangely when it isn't truly felt, or when it's tangled up with other emotions entirely. Relief, perhaps, or fear. Exactly what I have observed." Poirot leaned forward eagerly. "The widow, she puzzles me greatly. She has all the appearance of a woman hiding something. But what? Guilt? Or perhaps knowledge of her husband's darker nature? I knew Eleanor Venn, the colonel's first wife," Mrs. Phelps interjected. "Such a gentle, sweet woman. She died here in Hollowmere, in this very village. The colonel was devastated, or so everyone thought. Yet within a year, he'd married again. Lillian was so different from Eleanor, sophisticated, worldly, beautiful. Some said he was bewitched. "And what did you say, madam?" Poirot asked. "I said he was lonely and wanted a pretty ornament for his house," Mrs. Phelps replied tartly. Eleanor was a companion and friend. Lillian was I don't know quite what to call it. His prize, perhaps. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. How very sad for both of them. "In my experience, Mr. Poirot, when a man marries for display rather than affection, he often finds himself surprised when his ornament develops feelings of its own. You suspect she had a lover?" "I suspect nothing yet. But I do wonder about Dr. Lyle. He seems quite attentive to Mrs. Venn. I have noticed this also. And there is something else that troubles me greatly." Poirot withdrew a small notebook from his pocket. "Yesterday, I spoke with Mr. Bernard Colley, the solicitor, a most precise man, very concerned with proper procedure. He told me something most curious." He paused for dramatic effect, and both ladies leaned forward. 3 days before his death, Colonel Venn withdrew almost all his savings from the bank in London, nearly £20,000, a substantial fortune. He told the bank manager it was for an investment opportunity that required immediate cash. £20,000. Mrs. Phelps gasped. "Where is it now?" "That, madam, is the question. It has not been found in the house, Mr. Colley assures me. And there is more. The colonel did indeed provide a sealed document to Reverend Phelps, which was delivered to the solicitor after the colonel's death. It was a new will, dated 1 week before he died. In this will, he disinherited his widow almost entirely, leaving her only the house and a small annuity. The bulk of his estate, including those £20,000, should they be found, goes to Miss Alice Harrow." "Good heavens," Miss Marple said softly. "How very interesting. There is more still. When Mr. Colley informed Mrs. Venn of this will yesterday afternoon, she did not seem surprised, nor did she seem particularly distressed. She said only, 'Arthur always did like his games.' What do you make of that, mademoiselle?" Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her needles still. "I think, Mr. Poirot, that we are not dealing with a simple case of murder for inheritance. The pattern is more complex. Colonel Venn sounds like a man who enjoyed testing people, testing their loyalty, their honesty, their love. You think he staged something? A test of some kind?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that a man who withdraws £20,000 in cash and rewrites his will a week before his death is a man planning something. And a man who is buried with military honors and then disappears from his grave is a man who may have planned his disappearance too." Poirot's eyes lit up with admiration. "Mademoiselle, you have a most remarkable mind. You think the colonel is not dead?" "I think the colonel may have staged his own death to observe how people would react, to test them. It's exactly the sort of thing a proud, suspicious man would do." She paused, her expression darkening. "But if I'm right, Mr. Poirot, then something has gone terribly wrong with his plan. Because whether he intended to die or not, I believe Colonel Arthur Venn is now genuinely dead." "And murdered," Poirot added grimly, "which means someone discovered his deception and turned it to their advantage." The two detectives looked at each other with perfect understanding. Mrs. Phelps, pouring out more tea with trembling hands, could only murmur, gracious me indeed." Part 3. Secrets and Lies. Chapter 6. The Colonel's Study. With Mrs. Venn's reluctant permission, Poirot and Miss Marple, accompanied by Constable Briggs, as a gesture toward propriety, examined Colonel Venn's private study that afternoon. The room was a masculine sanctuary of leather and tobacco, military memorabilia, and hunting trophies. A tiger's head snarled from above the fireplace. Cross sabers decorated one wall. Yet despite its martial character, something about the room felt hollow, like a stage set rather than a lived-in space. "Everything is for show," Poirot murmured, running his finger along a bookshelf. The books are the right books for a military man. Histories of campaigns, biographies of generals, but they are barely opened. See how the spines are pristine. Miss Marple had moved to the desk, where papers lay in neat stacks. He was an organized man. Every document filed properly, every letter answered. Yet look here, Mr. Poirot, in the fireplace. The grate held the remains of burned papers, carefully incinerated but not completely destroyed. Poirot knelt beside it with his magnifying glass, extracting fragments with tweezers. "Regard as," he said triumphantly. "Here is a corner of a legal document. See the date? The same week he rewrote his will. And here, part of a name. Alice Har. The rest is gone. He burned the evidence of his original will," Miss Marple observed. "Or someone did. But why leave these fragments? A thorough person would have crushed them to powder. Unless they were interrupted," Poirot suggested. "Or unless—" He paused, tilting his head thoughtfully. "Unless the colonel himself burned them, but wished to leave just enough evidence to prove what he had done. Another test, perhaps? Or a trail of breadcrumbs for someone to follow." Constable Briggs, who had been watching this exchange of bemusement, cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, but are you saying the colonel burned his own will? That seems daft, if you'll excuse me saying so." "Not daft, Constable. Careful, methodical." Poirot moved to the desk and began opening drawers with systematic precision. A man who plans his own false death must be very careful indeed. He must convince everyone, including the doctor who examines him. But how would he manage that? Miss Marple asked. "Dr. Lyle is an experienced physician. That is the question that troubles me most. How does one convince a doctor that one is dead when one is not? Unless—" Poirot's eyes widened. "Unless the doctor is complicit in the deception." He pulled open the bottom drawer of the desk and stopped abruptly. Inside, beneath a sheaf of bank statements, lay a small brown bottle with a chemist's label. "Chloral hydrate," Poirot read aloud. "A powerful sedative. Prescribed by Dr. Edmund Lyle for insomnia, dated 2 weeks before the colonel's death." He held up the bottle to the light. "And it is nearly empty. Could he have taken too much accidentally?" Constable Briggs suggested. "Accidentally? No, I think not. A military man is precise about such things. But deliberately? To slow his heart rate, to make himself appear dead, or nearly so. That is possible, combined with hell breath and stillness. Yes, it might be done, for a short time at least." Miss Marple had found something else. "Mr. Poirot, look at this." She held up a leather-bound journal. Its pages filled with neat handwriting. It's the colonel's diary. The last entry is dated the day before his death. She read aloud. "Tomorrow the game begins in earnest. I have arranged everything precisely. The sedative will slow my heart to an imperceptible rate. Lyle has assured me it will work for the brief time needed. When I die, Lillian will show her true colors. If she mourns genuinely, I will reveal myself and beg her forgiveness. If she reveals herself as the mercenary creature I suspect, if she celebrates with her lover, then they will both be exposed and punished according to law. The new will is filed. Phelps has the envelope. Alice will be provided for. She at least has shown herself worthy of trust. I know this is cruel. Eleanor would have been disappointed in me. But I must know the truth. Better a cruel truth than a comfortable lie. If Lillian truly loves me, I will burn the new will, and we shall start afresh. If not, well, then justice will be served. The little gray pills Lyle provided will do the trick. I am to take 3 at precisely 2 p.m. tomorrow, then lie down in my chair. Within 15 minutes, my heart rate will be so slow as to be undetectable. For 1 hour, no more, I will appear dead. Lyle will be summoned immediately by the servant. He will examine me, pronounce me dead, and arrange for the undertaker. Before embalming can occur, I will have revived in the mortuary. It is a dangerous game, but worth the risk. Tomorrow I shall know the truth about my wife. The three investigators looked at each other in stunned silence. "Mon Dieu," Poirot whispered. "The Colonel, he planned everything. But something went wrong. Terribly, fatally wrong." "The doctor," Miss Marple said quietly. "Dr. Lyle was supposed to help him. But what if Dr. Lyle had his own plans?" Chapter 7. The Housekeeper's Tale. Mrs. Martha Kedge had been the Venn's housekeeper for 15 years, serving first Eleanor Venn and then, after that lady's death, the Colonel alone until his remarriage. She was a thin, angular woman of 60 with sharp eyes and pursed lips, the sort of servant who saw everything and forgot nothing. She received Miss Marple in the servants' hall with the wary deference due to a lady of quality. Poirot had tactfully suggested that Miss Marple conduct this interview alone. Servants, he noted, often spoke more freely to a gentlewoman than to a foreign detective, no matter how famous. "It's good of you to see me, Mrs. Kedge," Miss Marple said warmly, accepting a cup of strong tea. "Such a dreadful time for the household. You must have been devoted to Colonel Venn." "I was devoted to the Colonel's first wife, madam," Mrs. Kedge replied with careful precision. "As fine a lady as ever lived was Mrs. Eleanor. When she died, it near broke the Colonel's heart, or so I thought at the time. You sound doubtful now. Well, madam, a man who can marry again so quick, and to such a different sort of woman, it makes one wonder the heart was quite so broken as all that." Mrs. Kedge sniffed. "Not that it's my place to say, of course." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed placidly. "But one does notice things in a household. Was Mrs. Lillian a good mistress?" "She was as she was. Cold, I'd call her. Proper enough in her way, but never a kind word or a thought for those beneath her station. And she changed things, madam. All of Mrs. Eleanor's things, her photographs, her paintings, even her rose garden, all swept away like they'd never been. The Colonel didn't like it, I could tell, but he said nothing. Never contradicted his wife in public, he didn't. Did they quarrel in private?" Mrs. Kedge hesitated, loyalty warring with the evident desire to unburden herself. "I heard raised voices once or twice. About 6 months ago. It was... The Colonel accused her of carrying on with Dr. Lyle. She denied it, of course. But after that, the doctor's visits became more frequent, not less. Ostensibly for the Colonel's heart condition, but she left the implication hanging." "I see. And in the days before the Colonel's death, did you notice anything unusual?" "That's just it, madam. Everything was unusual. The Colonel became very secretive. He had a letter delivered, a letter with a London postmark. And after reading it, he shut himself in his study for hours. When he emerged, he looked, I don't know how to describe it, triumphant, almost, like a man who'd solved the puzzle." "When was this?" "About 10 days before he died. And then, a few days later, I heard him in his study late at night, burning papers. The smell of burning came right up through the house. And he had the Reverend Phelps visit, all very hush-hush. Signed something in a sealed envelope and had the Reverend promise to deliver it only if something happened to him." "Did Mrs. Venn know about these activities?" "Oh, she knew something was afoot. I heard her ask him what he was planning, and he just smiled at her, such a cold smile, madam, and said, 'You'll know soon enough, my dear, very soon indeed.'" Miss Marple set down her teacup thoughtfully. "One more question, if I may. After the Colonel's death, did Mrs. Venn receive any unusual correspondence?" Mrs. Kedge's expression changed subtly, a flicker of something that might have been fear. "Now that you mention it, yes. The morning before the funeral, a letter came. No stamp, no postmark. It must have been hand-delivered. Mrs. Venn read it and went white as a sheet. Dropped it right there on the breakfast table and ran from the room. I couldn't help but see what it said, madam." "And what did it say?" "Just one sentence, madam. 'The dead are not always buried.' That's all. No signature. Nothing else. Mrs. Venn burned in the grate right after, but she was shaking something terrible when she did it." Miss Marple felt a cold finger of certainty trace down her spine. "Thank you, Mrs. Kedge. You've been most helpful." As she left the servants' hall, Miss Marple's mind was racing. The pattern was becoming clearer, but the picture it revealed was darker than she had anticipated. Someone had known about the Colonel's plan. Someone had sent that letter to torment Mrs. Venn, or to warn her. But who? And more importantly, what had they done to the Colonel during that crucial hour when he lay in a death-like trance, vulnerable and unsuspecting? Chapter 8. The Discovery in the Second Grave. The fog had returned that night, thicker than ever, transforming Hollowmere into a ghost village where street lamps created isolated pools of gaseous light. Miss Marple had retired early, but sleep eluded her. Her mind kept returning to the pattern of deception and counter-deception that was emerging. At 11:30, a sharp knock sounded at the door of Mrs. Bantry's cottage. The maid, much alarmed, announced that Constable Briggs and Mr. Poirot required Miss Marple's immediate presence at the churchyard. "At this hour?" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. "Really, Jane, I don't think." But Miss Marple was already reaching for her coat. "I'm afraid murder keeps inconvenient hours, Dorothy. Don't wait up." The scene at St. Bartholomew's churchyard was macabre. Lanterns had been set up around a second excavation site, some 20 yards from the Colonel's now empty grave. Thomas Venn stood to one side, his face gray in the lamplight. Dr. Lyle was present as well, his medical bag clutched in white-knuckled hands. Poirot came forward to meet Miss Marple, his face grave. "Forgive me for disturbing your rest, mademoiselle, but I thought you should see this." Thomas Venn discovered it an hour ago while searching the grounds with his lantern. He led her to the edge of the newly opened grave. It was in an older section of the cemetery, where the gravestones dated back a century or more and were weathered almost to illegibility. The earth here was less tended, overgrown with brambles and ivy. But someone had dug here recently, very recently, and at the bottom of the shallow grave lay Colonel Arthur Venn. There could be no doubt it was him. He wore the dress uniform in which he had been buried, the metals gleaming in the lantern light, but his face was contorted in an expression of terror and agony, and around his neck the livid marks of strangulation were clearly visible. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured. "Now we know the truth. The Colonel, he did not die naturally. He was murdered." Dr. Lyle descended into the grave with professional efficiency, though his hands trembled slightly as he made his examination. After several minutes, he climbed out, his face grim. "Strangulation," he confirmed. "Manual strangulation, by the look of the bruising. Death would have occurred within minutes. As to when body temperature and rigor mortis are difficult to judge given the circumstances, but I would estimate he's been dead between 3 and 4 days." "Which means," Miss Marple said quietly, "that he died around the time of his funeral, or perhaps the day before." "Precisely. The funeral was a sham," Poirot said. "The coffin that was lowered into that grave was empty, or perhaps contained weights to simulate a body. The Colonel was already dead, hidden somewhere, waiting to be disposed of properly once suspicion had passed." Constable Briggs looked thoroughly overwhelmed. "But who would do such a thing? And why?" "Why is clear enough," Miss Marple observed. "Someone knew about the Colonel's plan to fake his death. Someone who stood to lose a great deal if the plan succeeded, or who stood to gain a great deal if the Colonel died for real." "The widow," Constable Briggs suggested. "She inherits the house and annuity even with the new will." "Or Dr. Lyle," Poirot added thoughtfully, "who had both the knowledge and the opportunity to turn the Colonel's sedation into genuine death." "Or Alice Harrow," Miss Marple said, though her tone was doubtful, "who inherits everything if the Colonel is truly dead." "Or," Poirot said slowly, "someone we have not yet considered. Someone who had their own reasons for wanting the Colonel dead." Dr. Lyle spoke up suddenly. "There's something else you should know. I didn't think it significant before, but now—" He hesitated, visibly struggling with himself. "3 weeks ago, the Colonel came to my surgery. He asked me to provide him with a sedative, something that would slow his heart rate dramatically, make him appear dead. At first, I refused, naturally, but he was most insistent. He said it was for an experiment, a test of some kind. He offered me £500. And you agreed? Poirot's voice was sharp. Yes. I gave him chloral hydrate and detailed instructions on the dosage. He was to take 3 tablets, no more, and someone was to revive him within 1 hour. I thought... Dr. Lyle's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I thought it was mad, but harmless. A rich man's eccentricity. I never imagined... You never imagined he would actually do it, Miss Marple finished gently, or that someone would take advantage of his vulnerable state. I should have refused, Dr. Lyle said miserably. I should have known something terrible would come of it. But he was so determined, and the money... I have debts, you see. Gambling debts. I needed the money desperately. Poirot studied the doctor with penetrating intensity. You were to be summoned when the colonel died. We? To pronounce him dead officially? Yes, that was part of the arrangement. I was to examine him, find no pulse or heartbeat, and declare him dead. Then, before the undertaker could begin embalming, I was to revive him with stimulants I had prepared. It should have worked perfectly. But it did not work, Poirot said, because when you arrived to examine the colonel, what did you find? Dr. Lyle's face crumpled. I found him genuinely dead, not sedated, dead. Strangled, though I couldn't see the marks on his neck at first because of the way he was positioned in his chair. His face was suffused with blood, his eyes. I knew immediately what had happened. Someone had killed him while he lay helpless. And you said nothing? Constable Briggs exploded. You pronounced him dead of natural causes when you knew he'd been murdered? What could I say? Dr. Lyle cried that I'd helped him fake his death and someone had used that opportunity to murder him? I would have been arrested immediately. My career ruined, my life destroyed. So I covered it up. I arranged for the quickest possible burial, made sure there was no post-mortem examination. I thought if he was buried quickly and quietly, that would be the end of it. But someone knew, Miss Marple said. Someone knew the coffin was empty because they had already taken the body and hidden it. Someone who planned to dispose of it permanently once the investigation, if there was one, had cooled. Who was first to discover the colonel's body? Poirot asked sharply. Mrs. Kedge, the housekeeper. She summoned me immediately. I arrived within 15 minutes. And in those 15 minutes, could someone have entered the study and attended to the colonel? It's possible, Dr. Lyle admitted. The house was in chaos. Mrs. Kedge had run out screaming. The servants were gathering. Anyone could have slipped in and out. Poirot's eyes gleamed with the light of understanding. I begin to see the truth, but we must examine every possibility with the most extreme care. A man is dead, genuinely dead, and his murderer is still among us, believing themselves safe. Mr. Poirot, Miss Marple said suddenly, there's something I found today that may be significant. She drew from her handbag a silk handkerchief, carefully folded. Mrs. Kedge gave this to me. She found it in the colonel's study, tucked behind a cushion, the day after his death. Look at the corner. Poirot examined it under his magnifying glass. Embroidered in fine silk thread was a single initial, E. E for Edmund? Constable Briggs suggested, looking at Dr. Lyle, but Miss Marple shook her head. E for Eleanor, the colonel's first wife. I recognized the style of the embroidery. Mrs. Phelps's one just like it that Eleanor made for her years ago. The question is, why would Eleanor Venn's handkerchief reappear now, 10 years after her death, in a house where her successor had removed all trace of her? The four of them stood in the fog-shrouded churchyard, the body of Colonel Arthur Venn lying at their feet, and contemplated this new mystery. Someone, Poirot said slowly, wanted us to think of Eleanor Venn. But why? What does the first Mrs. Venn have to do with the murder of the colonel? Everything, Miss Marple said quietly. I rather think she has everything to do with it. We've been so focused on the present Mrs. Venn, on Dr. Lyle, on the new will and the affair and the money. But what if the answer lies not in what the colonel was planning, but in what he had done? In the past, not the present? You think Eleanor Venn's death was not natural? Poirot asked. I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that we should find out exactly how Eleanor Venn died, and more importantly, who stood to benefit from her death. Part 4. The Past Unburied. Chapter 9. Eleanor's Story. The following morning, Poirot and Miss Marple called upon Reverend Phelps at the vicarage. The clergyman received them in his study, surrounded by dusty theological tomes and parish records dating back 2 centuries. Eleanor Venn, he repeated, his face troubled. Yes, of course I remember her. Such a tragedy. She was only 42 when she died. Consumption, or so we all believed. Believed? Poirot's eyebrows rose. You have doubts, mon reverend? I shouldn't speak ill of the dead. But since you ask, and since it may have bearing on poor Arthur's death. He removed his spectacles and polished them nervously. Eleanor's illness came on very suddenly. She had always been delicate, but she seemed to be managing well enough. Then, quite abruptly, she began to decline. Terrible wasting, difficulty breathing, coughing fits. Dr. Lyle, he had only recently arrived in Hollowmere, attended her constantly. Within 6 weeks, she was dead. Dr. Lyle treated her? Miss Marple's voice was sharp. Yes, he was most attentive, I must say. Visited her daily, sometimes twice daily in the final weeks. And the colonel, how did he respond to his wife's illness? He was strange about it, not grief-stricken. Exactly. More frustrated, I would say, as if her illness inconvenienced him. He spent very little time at her bedside, left most of her care to Dr. Lyle and the housekeeper. When she died, he arranged a swift, private burial and went to London for 3 months. When he returned, he had Lillian with him. Poirot and Miss Marple exchanged glances. Reverend, Miss Marple said gently, did Eleanor leave a will? I believe so, yes. She had a small inheritance from her father, perhaps £5,000. I understood she left it to various charities. The colonel, of course, had his own considerable wealth. Could we examine the parish death records? Poirot asked. Of course, of course. Reverend Phelps pulled down a leather-bound volume and opened it to the appropriate page. The entry for Eleanor Mary Venn was brief. Died June 15, 1915. Age 42. Cause of death, pulmonary tuberculosis. Attending physician, Drive E. Lyle. Buried June 18, 1915, St. Bartholomew's Churchyard. She was buried very quickly, Miss Marple observed. Only 3 days after death. Tuberculosis was thought to be contagious. Reverend Phelps explained. Swift burial was considered prudent, and no one questioned the diagnosis. Why would they? Dr. Lyle is a respected physician, and Eleanor had been clearly wasting away. We all saw it. After leaving the vicarage, Poirot and Miss Marple walked slowly through the village, their minds working in parallel. What are you thinking, mademoiselle? Poirot asked. I'm thinking about patterns, Miss Marple replied. In St. Mary Mead we had a case once, Mrs. Trout and her invalid mother. The mother had money, you see, and Mrs. Trout was very attentive, very devoted. She nursed her mother for months, and everyone praised her dedication. Then the mother died. Quite naturally, the doctor said. Mrs. Trout inherited everything. And 2 years later, Mrs. Trout's wealthy aunt came to stay. Within weeks, the aunt began to show the same symptoms. Wasting, weakness, digestive troubles. The same doctor attended her. But this time, a niece from London came to visit and insisted on a second opinion. They found arsenic in the aunt's system. Mrs. Trout had been poisoning both women slowly, and the doctor had been either incompetent or complicit. You think Eleanor Venn was poisoned? I think she was murdered, and that her symptoms were made to resemble consumption. And I think Dr. Lyle either helped to kill her or was paid to misdiagnose her deliberately. But why? Poirot demanded. What was the motive? The colonel didn't benefit financially from Eleanor's death. She had only a small inheritance, and he was already wealthy. No, Miss Marple agreed. But someone else might have benefited. Someone who wanted Eleanor out of the way. Someone who wanted to marry the colonel. Lillian Venn? Perhaps. Or perhaps someone wanted both Eleanor and the colonel dead, and has been planning this for 10 years. A patient murderer, Mr. Poirot, the most dangerous kind. They had reached the churchyard gate. The yew tree loomed above them, ancient and dark. Where's Eleanor Venn buried? Miss Marple asked suddenly. Poirot consulted his notes. Plot 47, in the older section of the cemetery, near where... He stopped abruptly. Near where we found the colonel's body. They hurried through the graveyard, past weathered monuments and leaning headstones, until they found the grave. The stone was simple but elegant. Eleanor Mary Venn, 1873 to 1915. Beloved wife. She sleeps in peace. And beside it, barely 10 feet away, was the freshly filled grave where Colonel Venn had been discovered. Not a coincidence, Poirot murmured. The murderer buried the colonel near his first wife deliberately. A message? A confession? Or simply a cruel joke? Or remorse? Miss Marple suggested quietly. In my experience, Mr. Poirot, murderers sometimes feel the need to make amends in strange ways. Perhaps whoever killed the colonel wanted to reunite him with Eleanor. Then we are looking for someone who loved Eleanor Venn and hated the colonel for what he did to her. Or someone who loved them both and was driven to desperation by the colonel's cruelty. A sound behind them made them both turn. Alice Harrow stood at the edge of the trees, her face pale and frightened. I heard you talking, she said in a trembling voice. About Eleanor, about murder. I think I know something. Something I should have told you before, but I was too afraid. Chapter 10, Alice's Confession. They retreated to the vestry of St. Bartholomew's Church, where Alice could speak without being overheard. The young woman was clearly terrified, twisting her handkerchief in her hands until Miss Marple gently took it from her and gave her a fresh one. Take your time, my dear, Miss Marple said kindly. We're here to help, not to judge. Alice took a shuddering breath. I wasn't entirely truthful before. About my relationship with Uncle Arthur. He wasn't really my uncle. I was no relation to him at all. Then how did you come to live at Venn Manor? Poirot asked. I'm Eleanor's daughter. Her daughter from a previous relationship, before she married the colonel. My real father died when I was an infant. When my mother married Colonel Venn, he agreed to take me in as his ward, but only on condition that I never claimed to be his child. I was to call him uncle and nothing more. He said it would complicate things if people knew he'd married a woman with an illegitimate daughter. Oh, my dear, Miss Marple said softly. How very hard for you. Mother never complained. She seemed grateful to him for accepting me at all. But as I grew older, I began to see how he treated her. He was cold, critical, controlling. He chose all her clothes, all her activities. He monitored her correspondence and questioned her about every conversation she had. She lived like a prisoner in a beautiful cage. And then she became ill, Poirot prompted gently. Alice's face crumpled. That's just it. I don't think she was ill. Not at first. I think she was being poisoned. The word fell into the vestry like a stone into still water. Why do you think this? Poirot asked. Because I saw him. I was only 14 at the time, but I remember Uncle Arthur would bring Mother her medicine every evening. A tonic, he said, prescribed by Dr. Lyle. But one night, I saw him in his study beforehand, adding something to the bottle, a white powder from a small vial. When I asked him what it was, he flew into a rage and locked me in my room for 2 days. Did you tell anyone? Who could I tell? I was a child, dependent on his charity. Mrs. Kedge thought I was imagining things. And Mother, Alice's voice broke. Mother refused to believe me. She said I was being hysterical, that Uncle Arthur loved her and would never harm her. She took the medicine every night until she died. And after her death, I was sent away to school. Uncle Arthur paid for everything, my education, my clothes, my lodging. He visited me twice a year and was always scrupulously polite and proper. But I knew what he'd done. Why did you come back to Hollowmere? Miss Marple asked. Because he summoned me 6 months ago, said he was getting older and wanted to make provision for my future. He decided to name me as his heir. I didn't understand why. He'd never shown me any particular affection. But I thought perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps he wanted to make amends. Did he ever speak of your mother's death? Only once, about a week before he died. He was in a strange mood, almost confessional. He said, I wronged Eleanor. I wronged her terribly, and I've paid for it every day since. But soon, Alice, soon things will be set right. I didn't know what he meant. Poirot leaned forward intently. Mademoiselle Alice, think carefully. On the day the Colonel died, where were you? I was in the village, at the library. I have witnesses. The librarian can confirm I was there all afternoon. When I returned to the house around 5 o'clock, Mrs. Kedge was screaming that the Colonel was dead. And you saw nothing suspicious? No one entering or leaving the house. Alice hesitated, then spoke in a rush. There was something. When I came up the drive, I saw someone at the study window. Just a shadow, really. But they were wearing a long coat, a military-style greatcoat. I assumed it was Uncle Arthur himself. But when I entered the house and heard he was dead, I realized it couldn't have been him. Could you identify this person? No. It was too far away and the fog was thick. But I remember thinking it was odd, because Uncle Arthur always hung his greatcoat in the hall, and it was still there when I entered the house. So someone else was wearing a similar coat, Miss Marple mused. Or perhaps the same coat. Where's this coat now? That's the strange thing. It disappeared. After the funeral, I looked for it to keep as a remembrance. But it was gone. Mrs. Kedge said Mrs. Venn had given it away to charity. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Most interesting. Most interesting indeed. Tell me, mademoiselle, in the time you've been back at Venn Manor, did you ever see your mother's handkerchiefs? The ones with her initial embroidered on them. Alice looked startled. Mother's handkerchiefs? No, never. Mrs. Venn destroyed all of Mother's personal effects years ago. At least, that's what Mrs. Kedge told me. Why do you ask? Because, Miss Marple said quietly, one of your mother's handkerchiefs was found in the Colonel's study after his death. Someone kept it all these years. Someone who remembered Eleanor Venn. Alice's eyes widened with understanding. You think someone killed Uncle Arthur to avenge my mother? It is one possibility among several, Poirot said cautiously. But we must consider all the evidence before we reach conclusions. Tell me, who else knew about your suspicions regarding your mother's death? No one. I never spoke of it to anyone after Mother died. I was too afraid. Not even to Dr. Lisle? Especially not to Dr. Lisle. He was the one who provided the medicine, who certified Mother's death. If Uncle Arthur was poisoning her, Dr. Lisle either knew about it or was criminally negligent. Poirot sat back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. We have a most complicated puzzle, Mademoiselle Marple. A man stages his own death to test his wife's fidelity, but is murdered during the attempt. 10 years earlier, his first wife dies under suspicious circumstances, possibly poisoned. The same doctor attends both deaths. The same house, the same players, but separated by a decade. What connects them? Guilt, Miss Marple said simply. And revenge. The Colonel felt guilty about Eleanor's death. His diary said as much. Perhaps he planned to confess as part of his resurrection. Perhaps he meant to expose Dr. Lyle's complicity. And someone couldn't allow that, Poirot finished. Someone who would hang if the truth about Eleanor Venn's death came to light. The three of them sat in the dim vestry, listening to the wind whistle through the eaves of the old church, and each contemplated the dark pattern of murder that was finally becoming clear. Part 5, The Net Tightens. Chapter 11, The Solicitor's Safe. Mr. Bernard Cawley's office was a bastion of legal respectability, all dark wood and leather and the musty smell of old documents. The solicitor himself was a precise man in his 60s, with silver hair and gold spectacles that he polished constantly. Mr. Poirot, Miss Marple. He greeted them with cautious courtesy. I must say, your continued interest in the Venn affairs is most unusual. The matter seems quite straightforward to me. A man dies, his will is read, his estate is distributed according to law. But the law can only distribute what exists in Poirot said pleasantly. And there is a small matter of £20,000 that seems to have vanished into thin air. Mr. Cawley's expression grew pained. Ah, yes, most irregular. I've made inquiries, naturally. The Colonel withdrew the money from his London bank in cash, as I told you. But as to what he did with it, he spread his hands helplessly. Perhaps it was stolen, Miss Marple suggested, by whoever murdered him. Perhaps, though why a murderer would steal the money and then allow the body to be buried without searching for it properly, it makes no sense. Unless, Poirot said thoughtfully, the murderer didn't know about the money, or didn't care about it. There are, after all, motives other than financial gain. Revenge, for instance, Miss Marple added. Mr. Cawley looked between them nervously. Are you suggesting the Colonel was murdered? But Dr. Lyle certified natural causes. Dr. Lyle has since revised his opinion. Poirot said dryly. But let's speak of other matters. You handled Eleanor Venn's estate when she died, did you not? I did. A simple matter. She left £5,000 to be divided among several charities, orphanages, hospitals, that sort of thing. Her personal effects went to the Colonel, though I understand he destroyed most of them. Why would he do that? Miss Marple asked. I have no idea. Grief takes people in strange ways, I suppose. Though between you and me, I never thought the Colonel particularly grief-stricken by Eleanor's death. He seemed relieved, if anything. Relieved? Well, she had been ill for some time. It was a drain on his energy and patience. Not a romantic sentiment, I grant you, but an honest one. Did the Colonel make a will after Eleanor's death? Poirot asked. He did. A very straightforward document, leaving everything to his future wife, should he marry again, and to various military charities if he did not. When he married Mrs. Lillian 3 years ago, that was updated to name her as primary beneficiary. And then 1 week before his death, he changed it again, precisely, to favor Miss Harrow instead. He was quite insistent that this new will be kept strictly confidential. No one was to know of its existence until after his death. Did he explain why? He said he had doubts about his wife's character and wished to test her loyalty. If she proved faithful, he said, he would destroy the new will and return to the previous arrangements. If not, Mr. Cawley shrugged. He was a suspicious man, Mr. Poirot. He saw conspiracies and betrayals everywhere. Sometimes, Miss Marple observed quietly, suspicious people have reason to be suspicious. Quite so, which brings me to something I found just this morning. Mr. Cawley opened his safe with an elaborate combination and withdrew a sealed envelope. This was also entrusted to me by the Colonel, with instructions to open it only if he should die under suspicious circumstances. And you define his current situation as suspicious? Poirot asked dryly. Being murdered and buried in an unmarked grave certainly qualifies, I should think. He broke the seal and withdrew a single sheet of paper, which he read with growing astonishment. Then he handed it wordlessly to Poirot. The detective read aloud. If you are reading this, then I am dead, and my plan has gone badly wrong. I write this as insurance, in case my attempt to expose treachery results in genuine tragedy. I have learned that my first wife, Eleanor, was murdered. For 10 years, I believed she died of consumption, but I recently discovered evidence that she was poisoned with arsenic over a period of months. The symptoms were made to resemble tuberculosis, and I, fool that I was, never questioned the diagnosis. The murderer is Dr. Edmund Lyle. I have evidence of his guilt, a letter from a London chemist showing that Lyle purchased large quantities of arsenic during the time of Eleanor's illness. The chemist has since died, but his records survive. I have them in my possession. Lyle's motive was financial. Eleanor's will, which he somehow knew about, left her fortune to several charities. But Lyle believed he could convince her to change it in his favor. When she refused, he killed her. I was too trusting, too blind. I allowed Lyle to attend her, never suspecting. When she died, I married quickly to fill the emptiness, and in doing so, I fear I compounded one evil with another. If I am dead, it is likely that Lyle discovered my knowledge and struck first. Arrest him. Search his premises. You'll find the evidence you need. My other sins are my own to answer for, but Eleanor deserves justice. Arthur Venn. The room was silent for a long moment. Mon Dieu, Poirot breathed. The colonel knew. He knew Dr. Lyle was a murderer, and yet he enlisted Lyle's help in faking his own death. Was this bravery or madness? It was a trap, Miss Marple said with certainty. Don't you see? The colonel wanted to catch Lyle in the act. He gave Lyle the perfect opportunity. A drugged, helpless victim who was supposed to appear dead. He expected Lyle to attempt murder, and he had planned some way to expose him. But the plan failed, Poirot said grimly, because Lyle did commit murder, and the colonel had no chance to expose him. Where are these documents about the arsenic purchase? I have no idea, Mr. Cawley said. If they were in the colonel's study, they should have been found during the inventory of his effects. But I've seen no such documents. Then either the colonel hid them very well, Miss Marple said, or the murderer found and destroyed them after killing the colonel. We must speak to Dr. Lyle immediately, Poirot declared, and we must search Venn Manor thoroughly. If those documents still exist, they're the key to everything. Chapter 12, The Doctor's Dilemma. They found Dr. Edmund Lyle in his surgery, a neat, well-appointed room that smelled of carbolic and iodine. He looked up from his desk as they entered, and his face went pale. Mr. Poirot, Miss Marple, I didn't expect to see you so soon. We have been to see Mr. Cawley, Poirot said, watching the doctor carefully. He shared with us a most interesting letter left by the late Colonel Venn. Dr. Lyle's hands began to tremble. He clasped them together to still them. I see. Then you know. We know what the colonel believed. Whether it's true or not remains to be determined. It's true. The words came out flat, dead. Eleanor Venn was poisoned with arsenic. I did it. The confession hung in the air like a thunderclap. Miss Marple, despite her years of observing human nature at its worst, felt a chill run through her. Why, Dr. Lyle? Why would you murder an innocent woman? Lyle laughed bitterly. Innocent? None of us were innocent in that house. Eleanor least of all. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the gray street. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, sadder. I loved her. From the moment I arrived in Hollowmere and met her, I loved her. She was everything that was good and gentle in the world, and she was trapped in a marriage to a monster. Colonel Venn? Yes. You think you knew him? You didn't. No one did except Eleanor and me. He was cruel, vindictive, controlling. He monitored everything she did, everyone she spoke to. He belittled her constantly, told her she was stupid and worthless. And when she tried to assert herself, he would... Lyle's voice dropped to a whisper. He would hurt her, not enough to leave marks that others would see, but enough to keep her afraid. How did you learn of this? Miss Marple asked gently. Eleanor told me. I was her physician. She came to me with various complaints, bruises, pains, difficulties sleeping. Eventually, she confided the truth. I urged her to leave him, but she refused. She said she had nowhere to go, no money of her own, and there was Alice to think of. The colonel had threatened to expose Alice's illegitimacy and ruin her chances in life if Eleanor ever left him. So you decided to free her by murdering her husband? No. Lyle turned sharply. I would have killed Venn gladly, but Eleanor wouldn't hear of it. She said she couldn't live with that on her conscience, no matter how much she suffered. So we made another plan. I would help her become ill. Nothing dangerous, just convincingly unwell. Then I would certify that she needed to convalesce abroad for her health. Once away from Venn, she could disappear, start a new life somewhere he'd never find her. But something went wrong, Poirot said. Everything went wrong. I gave her small doses of arsenic. Tiny amounts, enough to produce symptoms without real danger. But Venn grew suspicious. He began monitoring her medicine, questioning me, having her food tasted before she ate it. He was convinced someone was trying to kill her, and he was determined to catch them. So what did you do? I panicked. I increased the doses. Thinking if I made her more dramatically ill, Venn would be forced to let me take her away to a hospital. But the arsenic, it accumulated in her system faster than I anticipated. By the time I realized how much damage had been done, it was too late. She was dying, and there was nothing I could do to save her. Lyle's voice broke. I killed the woman. I loved trying to save her. And Venn knew. He must have suspected from the beginning. He watched me destroy her, and he said did nothing to stop it. He wanted to see if I would really go through with it. Why didn't he have you arrested? Miss Marple asked. Because he was playing a deeper game. He wanted to own me, to have power over me. After Eleanor died, he made it clear that he knew what I'd done. He said he had evidence, the chemist's records of my arsenic purchases. But he wouldn't expose me as long as I continued to serve his purposes. And he was useful, too. He would summon me at odd hours to treat his various ailments, real and imagined. And he made sure everyone saw how attentive I was to his new wife. To make people think you were having an affair, Poirot said. Precisely. There was no affair. Mrs. Lillian never looked at me twice. But Venn wanted people to think there was, wanted to give her a motive for murder should he choose to accuse her. He was building a case against everyone around him, collecting ammunition. He trusted no one. Yet he trusted you to help him fake his death. Poirot observed. He didn't trust me. He was testing me. He told me his plan and offered me £500 to provide the sedative and pronounce him dead. He wanted to see if I would take the opportunity to kill him for real. It was another of his sadistic games. And did you? Miss Marple asked quietly. Did you kill him, Dr. Lyle? Lyle turned to face them, and his eyes were filled with anguish. No, I swear to you, I did not. When I arrived at Venn Manor that afternoon and examined him, he was already dead, already strangled. Someone had gotten to him first. You covered up the murder, Poirot said. You pronounced him dead of natural causes, arranged for quick burial, prevented a post-mortem. Yes, because I knew I would be the prime suspect. I had motive, means, and opportunity. And my previous crime with Eleanor would come to light in any investigation. I panicked and tried to make it all go away. But someone else was cleverer, Miss Marple said. Someone removed the body before it could be buried, knowing that an empty grave would be discovered and you would be forced to tell the truth. I don't know who, Lyle said desperately. I've been trying to figure it out. Mrs. Venn? Alice Harrow? Even Mrs. Kedge might have had motives I don't know about. But I swear to you, I didn't kill Arthur Venn. I wanted him dead 1,000 times, but I didn't kill him. Poirot studied the doctor for a long moment. I believe you, he said finally. You are many things, Dr. Lyle. A fool, a coward, a man who made terrible choices. But I do not think you are a liar. Not now, at least. The guilt has eaten you alive these 10 years, Non. Every day, Lau whispered. Every single day. Then help us now. Where would the colonel have hidden his evidence against you? Where are these documents from the chemist? I don't know. I've searched everywhere I could think of. His study, his bedroom, his private safe. Nothing. Either they never existed, or someone else found them first. Or, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, they're hidden somewhere so obvious that no one would think to look there. Mr. Poirot, I think we need to return to Venn Manor. And this time, we need to search it properly. Chapter 13, The Hidden Room. Mrs. Lillian Venn received them in the drawing room with icy composure. She wore deep mourning, but her face showed neither grief nor distress. Only a kind of watchful wariness, like a chess player contemplating her opponent's next move. Mr. Poirot, Miss Marple, to what do I owe this latest intrusion? We require your permission, madam, to search your late husband's effects more thoroughly, Poirot said. There are documents that may be relevant to the investigation of his death. What investigation? The police seemed quite satisfied that Arthur's death was natural, despite the peculiar business with the grave. The police, Poirot said gently, do not yet know all the facts, but they will soon. It would be better for everyone if we resolve this matter quietly, before official channels become involved. Something flickered in Mrs. Venn's eyes, calculation perhaps, or fear. You may search where you wish. I have nothing to hide. Thank you, madam. One question first, if you permit. How much did you know of your husband's plan to fake his death? Mrs. Venn's composure cracked slightly. What are you talking about? Your husband planned to take a sedative that would make him appear dead, then revive after his funeral to observe how you reacted. He wanted to test your loyalty. Did you know of this plan? For a long moment, Mrs. Venn said nothing. Then, slowly, she began to laugh, a harsh, bitter sound without humor. Know of it? I discovered it by accident the day before he died. I found his diary, read his intentions. I was to be tested like some laboratory animal, judged and found wanting according to his mad criteria. That's when I knew I had to leave him. I packed my things that night, wrote him a letter explaining that I was going to London and would not return. I planned to leave the next morning. But you did not leave. No, because the next morning he was dead, and suddenly I was trapped. If I left, I would look guilty. So I stayed, played the grieving widow, and waited for someone to realize what had really happened. Did you kill him? Miss Marple asked directly. No, Mrs. Venn said, meeting her eyes. But I'm not sorry he's dead. I won't pretend to mourn a man who married me only to torment me, who staged his own death to prove I didn't love him. And yes, I did have feelings for Dr. Lyle. What woman wouldn't? When he showed me more kindness in a week than Arthur did in 3 years of marriage. But there was no affair, whatever Arthur believed. Edmund Lyle loved a ghost. He never saw me at all. Where were you when your husband died? Poirot asked. In the village. I went to the draper's shop to order new curtains. There are witnesses. I returned home around 4 o'clock and found Mrs. Kedge in hysterics. Dr. Lyle was already there, examining Arthur's body. Did you see anyone else in the house? Anyone who shouldn't have been there? Mrs. Venn hesitated. There was something. When I came up the drive, I thought I saw a movement in Arthur's study window. But when I entered the house, the study was empty except for Arthur's body. I assumed I'd imagined it. The person Miss Alice saw, Miss Marple murmured. The figure in the military greatcoat. What greatcoat? Mrs. Venn asked sharply. Your husband's military greatcoat. The one that disappeared after his death. Did you give it away? Certainly not. I didn't touch any of Arthur's military things. They held too many bitter memories. Then someone took it, Poirot said. Someone who wanted to impersonate the colonel, perhaps, or simply to cover their own clothing while they committed murder. He stood decisively. Come, Mademoiselle Marple, let's begin our search. Mrs. Venn, you may accompany us if you wish." They started in the Colonel's study, examining every book, every drawer, every corner. Miss Marple noticed something that had escaped her before. The bookshelf along the south wall was slightly shallower than the others, though all were built in the same style. "Mr. Poirot," she called softly, "look at this." Together they examined the bookshelf more closely. Poirot's sensitive fingers found a hidden catch, and with a soft click, the entire section swung outward to reveal a small room beyond. Barely more than a closet, really, but fitted out as a private archive. Inside were filing cabinets, boxes of documents, and journals dating back decades. And on a small desk, illuminated by the shaft of light from the study, lay a leather portfolio tied with string. Poirot opened it carefully. Inside were letters, receipts, and a detailed record in the Colonel's own hand documenting his investigation into Eleanor's death. There were copies of the chemist's records showing Dr. Lyle's arsenic purchases. There were notes on Eleanor's symptoms and their progression, and there was a letter from a London specialist whom the Colonel had consulted, confirming that Eleanor's symptoms were consistent with chronic arsenic poisoning. "He kept everything," Mrs. Venn breathed, looking over Poirot's shoulder. "All his evidence against everyone. Look, there are files on every person in Hollowmere, everyone he suspected of something. Indeed, there were files on Dr. Lyle, on Mrs. Venn herself, on Alice, on the servants, even on Reverend Phelps. The Colonel had been a meticulous chronicler of human weakness and vice. A dangerous hobby," Miss Marple observed. "Collecting secrets. It makes one wonder how many people wanted him dead." But only one succeeded, Poirot said. He was examining another document. A letter in an unfamiliar hand. "Regard as. This is most curious." The letter was dated 3 weeks before the Colonel's death. "Colonel Venn, I have considered your proposal carefully. Yes, I will help you expose the truth about Eleanor's death. Yes, I will testify if needed. But you must understand the risk you're taking. Edmund Lyle is desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. I advise extreme caution. Do not confront him directly. Do not give him opportunity to silence you as he silenced Eleanor. Your obedient servant, M. Pritchard. M. Pritchard," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "That name is familiar somehow. It was the housekeeper here when Eleanor died." Mrs. Kedge's voice came from the doorway. They turned to see her standing there, her face ashen. "Martha Pritchard. She was let go shortly after Eleanor's death, sent away with a generous reference. I replaced her. Where is she now?" Poirot demanded. "Dead, sir. She passed away 2 years ago. I heard about it from a cousin who knew her. Natural causes, they said." "Or so it appeared," Miss Marple said quietly. "How very convenient for someone that she died before she could testify." Poirot continued searching the hidden room. At the very back, behind a stack of old military reports, he found a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a single handkerchief embroidered with the letter E, and beneath it, a daguerreotype photograph. The photograph showed a young woman of perhaps 30, with gentle eyes and a sweet smile. She sat in a garden, and beside her stood a girl of perhaps 10, unmistakably a young Alice Harrow. On the back, in faded ink, was written, "Eleanor and Alice, June 1905. My beloved wife and daughter." "Daughter," Mrs. Venn repeated. "Not ward. Daughter." "The Colonel lied," Miss Marple said. "Alice wasn't his ward. She was his stepdaughter. He claimed her as his own daughter in this private inscription. Why deny it publicly?" "Pride," Mrs. Kedge said bitterly from the doorway. The Colonel was too proud to admit his wife had borne another man's child, so he pretended Alice was just a ward, a charity case he'd taken in. But he loved her in his way. That's why he left everything to her in the end. And that, Poirot said slowly, gives Miss Alice a very strong motive for murder, does it not? If she knew about the new will, if she knew she would inherit everything if the Colonel died... "No," Miss Marple said firmly. "Alice didn't kill him. I'm quite certain of that. How can you be certain? Because I understand the pattern now. This isn't about inheritance, Mr. Poirot. It never was. This is about justice. Twisted, perhaps, but justice nonetheless. Someone killed Colonel Venn to punish him for Eleanor's death. Someone who loved Eleanor enough to wait 10 years for the perfect opportunity. But who? Mrs. Venn asked. Dr. Lyle claims he didn't do it. Alice was in the village. I was as well. Who else would have cared enough about Eleanor to commit murder? Miss Marple's face was grave. That, my dear, is what we must discover. But I suspect the answer is closer than we think. Part 6, The Solution. Chapter 14, The Drawing Room Revelation. The following evening, Hercule Poirot requested the presence of all interested parties in the drawing room of Venn Manor. Mrs. Lillian Venn, Dr. Edmund Lyle, Miss Alice Harrow, Mrs. Kedge the housekeeper, and Reverend Phelps all gathered with varying degrees of reluctance and apprehension. Constable Briggs stood by the door, ready to act if needed. Miss Marple sat in a corner with her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the tense silence. Poirot stood before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his egg-shaped head tilted slightly as he regarded his audience. Madame et Messrs, he began, we are gathered here to resolve the death of Colonel Arthur Venn, a death that appeared natural, then became mysterious, and finally revealed itself as murder most foul. We know Dr. Lyle killed him, Mrs. Venn said impatiently. He's confessed to murdering Eleanor. Surely, Dr. Lyle did not kill Colonel Venn. Poirot interrupted. This I know with certainty. Though he is guilty of many things, this particular crime is not his. Dr. Lyle looked up with desperate hope. Then who? Let us begin at the beginning, Poirot said. 10 years ago, Eleanor Venn died of what appeared to be consumption. In reality, she was murdered, slowly poisoned with arsenic administered by Dr. Lyle, who believed he was saving her from an abusive husband, but instead killed her through incompetence and panic. Colonel Venn suspected this truth, but could not prove it, so he collected evidence, built a case, and waited. 3 years ago, he married Mrs. Lillian, not for love, but for show, and perhaps to assuage his own loneliness. But the marriage was loveless, and he grew to suspect his new wife of infidelity with Dr. Lyle. 6 months ago, he summoned Alice Harrow back to Hollowmere and changed his will in her favor. Then, 3 weeks ago, he decided to stage an elaborate test. He would fake his own death, observe how people reacted, and use their responses to confirm his suspicions about his wife and Dr. Lyle. He enlisted Dr. Lyle's help, offering him money and a promise not to expose Eleanor's murder if Lyle cooperated. Dr. Lyle agreed, seeing no alternative. The colonel took a powerful sedative that would slow his heart to an imperceptible rate. He would appear dead for approximately 1 hour, then revive. But someone discovered this plan. Someone who saw the perfect opportunity for justice or vengeance. Someone who had waited 10 years to punish Colonel Venn for his sins. The room was utterly silent, except for the soft click of Miss Marple's knitting needles. On the afternoon of his stage death, the colonel took the sedative as planned. He lay in his study, helpless, barely alive. The servants were instructed to summon Dr. Lyle immediately if anything happened. But before the doctor could arrive, someone else entered the study. This person wore the colonel's military greatcoat. To disguise themselves, they strangled the helpless colonel with their own hands, then arranged his body to appear as if he had died naturally in his chair. They took the greatcoat with them when they left. Dr. Lyle arrived and found the colonel genuinely dead. Terrified of exposure, he pronounced death by natural causes and arranged for a quick burial. But the murderer wasn't finished. They knew the grave would be opened eventually, that the truth would come out, so they waited until after the funeral, then returned to the churchyard. They exhumed the body secretly, planning to dispose of it permanently, but something made them hesitate. Instead, they buried the colonel near his first wife's grave, a symbolic gesture, perhaps, remorse, or a message to the world about the colonel's guilt. But who? Alice cried. Who had the opportunity? Who could have entered the study undetected? Poirot's eyes swept the room. Someone who knew the house intimately. Someone who had access to all areas at all times. Someone who loved Eleanor Venn enough to wait a decade for justice. His gaze settled on the housekeeper, Mrs. Martha Kedge. The housekeeper's face went white, then red. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You're mad," she whispered. "I'm just a servant." "You were Eleanor's devoted friend," Miss Marple said gently, setting aside her knitting. "More than a friend, perhaps." Mrs. Phelps mentioned that Martha Pritchard was a housekeeper when Eleanor died. But Martha Pritchard died 2 years ago. Yet here you are, Martha Kedge, who supposedly replaced her. The names are so similar, almost as if someone wanted to honor a friend while still hiding their identity. Mrs. Kedge swayed slightly. "You don't understand." "Oh, but we do," Poirot said. "You were Eleanor's companion before she married Colonel Venn. When she married, you took a position as her housekeeper, so you could remain close to her. You loved her, and you watched helplessly as the Colonel tormented her, as Dr. Lyle accidentally poisoned her. You suspected the truth even then, but you had no proof, no power. So after Eleanor died, you left Hollowmere. You became Martha Kedge instead of Martha Pritchard, changed your appearance slightly, and waited. When the Colonel married again, you applied for the housekeeper position under your new name. And you've been waiting all these years for an opportunity to make him pay. When Martha Pritchard, your cousin or sister, perhaps, who helped you create this new identity, died, you knew your time was running out. If the Colonel's investigation into Eleanor's death continued, he might discover that you and Martha Pritchard were connected. So when you learned of his plan to fake his death, you saw your chance. Mrs. Kedge's shoulders began to shake. "He killed her," she said, her voice breaking. "Not Dr. Lyle, the Colonel. He drove her to it. He made her so desperate to escape that she agreed to that mad poisoning scheme. And even when she lay dying, even when she knew what was happening, he did nothing. He watched her die because he wanted to prove she betrayed him. You saw him that day," Miss Marple said. "Saw him watching Eleanor suffer in her final hours. You told the Colonel what you'd witnessed, and that's when he sent you away." "He threatened me," Mrs. Kedge said. "Told me if I ever spoke of what I'd seen, he'd have me arrested for conspiracy to murder. Said I'd helped Dr. Lyle by not reporting my suspicions sooner. He was right, in a way. I did suspect, and I said nothing because I thought—" Her voice broke into sobs. "I thought Eleanor would escape and be free. I thought she'd survive." "So you waited 10 years, Poirot said softly. "You changed your identity, returned, and waited. And when the Colonel set his trap for his wife and Dr. Lyle, you turned against him. How did you know about his plan?" Alice asked. "I heard him talking to Dr. Lyle," Mrs. Kedge said. "I listen at doors. It's what servants do, how we survive in a world where we're invisible. I heard everything, and I knew this was my chance. So on that afternoon, when the Colonel took his sedative, you waited until the house was empty. You put on his greatcoat from the hall, entered the study, and—" Poirot paused delicately. "I strangled him," Mrs. Kedge said flatly. "I looked into his eyes as I did it. I wanted him to know. I wanted him to understand that this was for Eleanor. He tried to fight, but he was too weak from the drug. It was over quickly. And then you removed the body after the funeral and buried it near Eleanor's grave. I wanted them together. Eleanor loved him once, despite everything. She would have wanted him to rest beside her. I thought—" Her voice quivered. "I thought I was doing right by her, giving her back her husband, even in death." The room was silent, except for Mrs. Kedge's quiet weeping. "Mrs. Kedge," Constable Briggs said heavily, moving toward her. "Martha Kedge, I'm arresting you for the murder of Colonel Arthur Venn." "Wait," Alice said suddenly. She stood, her face pale but determined. "Mrs. Kedge loved my mother. She avenged her when no one else would. The colonel was a cruel man who tormented his wife and drove her to her death. Doesn't that count for something? The law does not recognize vengeance as justification for murder, Miss Harrow, Poirot said gently, no matter how righteous it may feel. Then the law is wrong, Alice said fiercely. My mother died slowly, painfully, while everyone watched and did nothing. Mrs. Kedge is the only one who truly loved her, who tried to protect her, and now you'll send her to the gallows for it. That will be for a jury to decide, Constable Briggs said, but his voice was not unkind. As he led Mrs. Kedge from the room, she paused beside Alice. Your mother loved you more than life itself, she said softly. She stayed with him for your sake, to protect you. Never forget that. Then she was gone, and the room seemed suddenly colder and emptier. Chapter 15, Reflection. Later that evening, Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot sat together in the drawing-room of Mrs. Bantry's cottage. A fire crackled cheerfully in the grate, and Mrs. Bantry had thoughtfully provided tea and excellent seed cake before retiring to bed. A sad business, Miss Marple said, pouring out the tea. Justice and vengeance are such close cousins, and yet so different in the eyes of the law. Oui, Poirot agreed. Martha Kedge committed murder, and for that she must answer. Yet one cannot help but feel sympathy for her. She loved deeply and suffered greatly. The colonel created his own tragedy, Miss Marple observed. His suspicious nature, his need to test and prove everyone's unworthiness. It destroyed Eleanor, drove Dr. Lyle to murder, and ultimately caused his own death. If he had simply loved and trusted his first wife, none of this would have happened. And yet, mademoiselle, can we say he was wrong to suspect? Dr. Lyle was poisoning Eleanor, even if incompetently. Mrs. Lillian did not love him. His suspicions were justified. Were they? Or did his suspicions create the very betrayals he feared? Miss Marple set down her teacup thoughtfully. I knew a man once in St. Mary Mead, Mr. Harper. He was convinced his wife was unfaithful, though she wasn't. He spied on her, questioned her, made her life miserable with his accusations. Eventually, she left him for another man, not because she had ever wanted to, but because he'd made her so wretched that anything seemed better. His suspicions created the very infidelity he'd feared all along. The self-fulfilling prophecy, Poirot mused. Oui, I see your point. The colonel's cruelty drove Eleanor to desperate measures, which confirmed his suspicions, which made him crueler still. A terrible cycle. And Dr. Lyle? Miss Marple asked. What will become of him? That depends on whether the authorities pursue charges for Eleanor's death. With the colonel dead and Martha Kedge facing trial, the evidence may be examined. But 10 years have passed, and the witnesses are dead or compromised. It will be difficult to prove anything in court. He'll live with the guilt, Miss Marple said. That's often a worse punishment than prison. Every day for the rest of his life, he'll remember that he killed the woman he loved. There is one thing that troubles me still, Poirot said. The 20,000 pounds. We never found it. What did the colonel do with all that money? Miss Marple smiled slightly. I think I know. The colonel was planning to confess everything after his resurrection. To expose Dr. Lyle, to make amends to Alice for denying her as his daughter, and to prove his wife's infidelity or innocence. The money was probably meant for Alice, a way to provide for her future independent of the will. He likely hid it somewhere only he knew about. But where? I suspect it's still in a hidden room at Venn Manor, behind one of those filing cabinets, or tucked into a box labeled as something mundane. Alice will find it eventually, when she takes possession of the house. And she'll need it, I think. The inheritance will be tied up in legal challenges for years once Mrs. Lillian contests the will. Will she contest it? I doubt it. She seemed almost relieved to have an excuse to leave Hollowmere. I believe she'll take her annuity in the house, which she can sell, and make a new life elsewhere. As for Dr. Lyle, he'll likely leave as well. Too many ghosts in this village. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the fire. You know, mademoiselle, Poirot said, When I first saw you at the Colonel's funeral, I thought you were simply another village lady, knitting and gossiping. But you have, I think, a most remarkable mind. Your understanding of human nature is profound." Miss Marple smiled modestly. "Oh, I don't think so, Mr. Poirot. I simply compare people to folks I've known in St. Mary Mead. Human nature is much the same everywhere. The patterns repeat themselves. Once you've seen one tragedy, you've seen them all in one form or another. But it is not depressing to you to see always the evil in human hearts. Not evil, Mr. Poirot. Weakness. There's a difference. Martha Kedge wasn't evil. She was desperate and heartbroken. Dr. Lyle wasn't evil. He was foolish and cowardly. Even Colonel Venn, cruel as he was, wasn't wholly evil. He loved Eleanor in his way, and he tried to make amends in the end. People are complicated creatures, capable of both great kindness and terrible cruelty. And that," Poirot said, raising his teacup in salute, "is why you are able to solve murders. You understand not just the crime, but the human being who committed it. As do you, Mr. Poirot. Your little gray cells are quite remarkable. And your knitting needles are most observant," he replied with a smile. They finished their tea companionably. Two detectives of vastly different methods, but similar understanding, united in their pursuit of truth and justice. Outside, the fog closed over Hollowmere once again, soft and gray and endless. But in Mrs. Bantry's cottage, the fire burned bright, and for a moment at least, all was well. Epilogue, 6 months later. Miss Marple received a letter from Alice Harrow in the spring. The young woman had inherited Venn Manor after all, though Mrs. Lillian had contested the will briefly before accepting a generous settlement and departing for the continent. Alice wrote, "Dear Miss Marple, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to tell you that I've decided to turn Venn Manor into a school for girls, particularly girls like myself, who have difficult family circumstances. I found Uncle Arthur's hidden money exactly where you suggested, behind the filing cabinets in his secret room. It was more than enough to make the necessary changes to the house. Mrs. Kedge's trial ended last month. The jury was surprisingly sympathetic, given what came out about my mother's death and the Colonel's behavior. She was sentenced to 15 years rather than hanging. I visit her when I can, and she seems at peace somehow. She says she would do it all again. Dr. Lyle has left England for Canada, where he hopes to practice medicine under a different name. I don't know if he'll find redemption there, but I hope he does. He tried to save my mother, even if he failed terribly. As for me, I'm learning to remember both my mother and Uncle Arthur with complicated feelings rather than simple grief or anger. People are rarely all good or all bad, are they? Thank you for your kindness and your wisdom. I hope our paths cross again someday. Yours sincerely, Alice Harrow." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her correspondence box. Then she picked up her knitting, a new scarf, dove gray like the Hollowmere fog, and settled into her chair with a slight smile. The patterns repeated themselves, yes, but sometimes, just sometimes, they could be broken, and that made all the difference.